All right, we are here with Claude Goldenberg. This is the Reading Instruction Show. I'm your host, Dr. Andy Johnson. And Claude and I haven't talked before this. There's no pre-conversation because we thought the conversation that takes place actually is good for everyone to hear. So good to see you again, Claude.
Thanks, Andy. It's great to see you. Thanks very much.
I appreciate the polite conversation. And I know you think I'm as wrong as I think you're wrong, and that's a good thing, Claude.
That's right. Let's put our cards right on the table.
There's this natural inclination to think that when you find someone wrong, you just have to give them stuff to change them of their wrongness. And if you're just one article away from discovering how wrong you are about everything. Isn't that the premise we start with?
Well, let me beg to differ.
Oh, you
Uh,
agree with me. All right. Woo-hoo. All right. This has been the reading instruction.
that was pretty tricky how you did that. No, I mean, the thing is that, and we talked about this either when we were recording or before we were recording or whenever. But mindsets, worldviews, let's call them paradigms. I mean, choose your terminology, are very difficult to change. In fact, I was reminded of this when I was listening to, what was I listening to? Something that had nothing to do with reading, and it had to do with mindsets about artificial intelligence and what's coming down the pike, and are people prepared? So it had nothing to do with reading, but is the Ezra Klein show. He has a very interesting podcast, and he always at the end asks his guests for suggestions for three books that everyone should read. And so his guest, who was the former AI advisor in the Biden White House, the first book he mentioned was the Thomas Kuhn's book on the structure of scientific revolutions, where he introduced this concept of paradigm and how sort of deep-seated it is. One thing that Ezra's guest didn't mention was that Thomas Kuhn was very pessimistic about paradigms changing within people's heads. And you have to wait for the old paradigm propagators to die off and for a new generation of new paradigm thinkers and paradigmers, to come of age. So if you take that literally, it's, I mean, forget about trying to change minds when people's paradigms clash. You got to wait for them to die off and hope that some new crop comes up with a more accurate paradigm, or at least one you agree with. So that's either pessimistic or optimistic. You can take your choice.
Paradigms are meant to change, just as theories are meant to evolve and change. And I think that book was written in 62. Am I correct?
That sounds about right.
Yeah. So I'm sure if Thomas was alive today, his paradigm would continue to change, hopefully. And that's reminiscent of Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration. We have
Hmm.
these cognitive structures in our head. And when we are experiencing depression or growth of any kind, those old structures have to disintegrate before we can get to higher structures. It's the time between where there's this discomfort. And that is where we're at when we're switching from one worldview to the next. But paradigms are what we'll call them theories or ways of thinking or whatever you want to call them. They're meant to become obsolete as we get new information. I remember David Fauci, is it David Fauci? Anthony Fauci. By people who don't understand science, he was discredited because at the beginning of COVID, he said one thing, and as he got more information, he said other things. Well, that's how science works, people. You don't set out with one idea and stick.
Yeah. Well, sometimes they stick. Sometimes they're open. Piaget has this concept of assimilation and accommodation to explain what he call epigenetic cognitive development. That as we proceed as we grow and we experience more things cognitively, we're born with certain structures, And then as information comes in, visually, auditorily, however it comes in, we assimilate some of that information. But then when it's not consonant with the structures that we have, then we have to do some accommodation. We change those structures. So assimilation and accommodation, I mean, I'm a sort of a, I don't know, reformed Piagetian, but I studied Piaget, so I hope I'm getting this right. That's the process of cognitive development. Now, we would think in human terms or even in adult terms that there would be assimilation and accommodation. But to your point, Andy, I find that it's very difficult. I mean, when you've got some kind of an, personal identity, some sort of intellectual investment in a particular mental structure, scheme, paradigm, I'm using the terms probably sloppily but interchangeably,
Yeah.
it's very difficult to shift and change and accommodate to information that didn't fit with the structure that you previously held on to. People are very loath to give up those structures and accommodate to new information. I mean, that's been my experience.
And I think I agree with you there. I posit too that assimilation and accommodation happens at different levels as we grow older. It's not germane just to that level of childhood.
Completely.
Hopefully, if
Hopefully.
we're growing and thinking,
Yeah.
and hopefully we all assimilate and we accommodate to some degree at
Yeah.
some point.
Yeah. You would hope. And that's why I value these conversations with you. I mean, I'm not going to, I'm not trying to, how should I say, lobby to change your mind, get into your head. And if I, I sent you an article a little while ago. If you just read this, then you'll see how wrong you are and how right I am. I mean, I left that in the rearview mirror a long time ago. But having these kind of discussions. So if I could, I mean, I want to ask you a couple of specific questions. Would that be okay?
Please
Um,
do.
because my first question is, in our last conversations, you'll recall, we had a conversation about the neuroscientific evidence about reading and what neuroscientists, preeminently Stanislas Dehaene, but not necessarily him, and that an MD neurologist, Stephen Strauss, you said, well, he doesn't really agree with that. And I said, well, he doesn't really have much claim to agree or disagree because he's not a neuroscientist. And he said,
Well,
well, other neuros,
I can comment on specific articles. I'm not going to get into
you're
who's
not going to,
qualified and who's not.
that's fine. No
But if you
problem.
want me to comment
Absolutely.
on a specific research article, I can do that.
Sure. Okay. Absolutely. I take your point. So the question was, do other neuroscientists disagree with the proposition that you need to create this neuro circuit, this brain circuit, and that by using fMRIs, you can document that and understand it in a way that's very important. And you said a lot of neuroscientists don't agree with that. And you were going to, and I said, who? Who disagrees with that? And you brought up Strauss. I said, well, he's not a neuroscientist, but I'm not going to get into that. And you said you're going to look for some neuroscientists who agree with him. So my first question is, what'd you find?
Two things. I someday hope to speak for all neuroscientists. That is a goal I have in life. The second thing, I forgot.
Mm,
I'm sorry, Claude.
okay,
I'm
it's
trying to
okay.
write a book and get all this and teach courses.
I understand. I understand. Okay, but can we put a pin on it and at some point come back to it?
Could you remind me?
Again, I will be happy to. I will be
Just
happy
send me an
to.
email. And
I
I'm
will do that.
always happy to read an article and comment on an article.
Okay, okay, that's great. So then that's my second question because I sent you an article. It was just a little while ago, and it's a long, dense 50-page article. So there's no expectation that you've read it. So, but it's by, uh, oh, you have it printed out?
Yeah.
Awesome. So it's by a, really world-class reading scientist. He's an Israeli academic, David Sher, that maybe some of your
Oh, I must have
listeners.
a different one. I have Airy, Dryer, Flugman, and Gross.
Oh, that's a different one.
Yeah,
That's a good one too.
that's the
But the
one
one,
I've read.
oh, okay. But let me just talk briefly. Oh, do you want to talk about that one? We can talk about
I
that
didn't
one.
I didn't get to the other one.
Okay. Well, just very briefly, I just want to mention Cher's article, and I don't know if you're able to like put links to things on your when you send this out.
Uh,
I'll send you a link.
I can certainly put a link with it, but I haven't read the article, so it's really
Okay.
a one-way conversation.
Absolutely. Okay. I just want to bring it up because I think it's a really informative article and we can
Okay.
defer it till later. Because let me tell you why I brought it up. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation in the past 2 weeks, and your very strong position that holism, teaching reading in a holistic conception is very, very important. And share in this article what he's talking about is you have to look at reading systems and writing systems and learning and teaching reading uh, from a worldwide perspective to avoid the ethnocentrism that is always in danger. You're always in danger of falling into if you just look at one language, one country, one writing system. So he takes a look at writing systems, logographic, alphabetic, morphosyntactic, all those kinds of things, and says, what can we bring together a unified theory of reading development by looking at all the languages?
Oh, that
It's an
was,
ex
yeah, that was the one I printed off, the 50
Yeah,
page.
right.
Holy jeez.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
No,
I mean,
I got through the abstract and that's about where I am on
okay. Well,
that one.
let's talk about that let's put a pin on it and talk
Let's
about it
talk on that.
some other time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know if, I don't have very definite positions on something. I don't want to be characterized by one position or another. Uh,
Okay.
I have a lot of thinking on a lot of stuff. I have kind of a holistic idea that the brain is a meaning making mechanism and a predictive mechanism and a sense making mechanism. It looks for
Yes.
patterns. In
Yes.
that sense, meaning precedes decoding.
Yes.
In that, when you pick up a book, your head is already starting to say book, sentences, words, whatever the topic is. So you're already using that spreading activation to make predictions about what the book is about. And as soon as you start to engage, you're making more predictions and you're making sense of that. So our brain looks for the most efficient ways to create meaning with oral and written language, as well as the world around us.
Yes, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we have no disagreement. The issue or the difference is when it comes to processing written language, because written language is not inherently meaningful in the same way that oral language is meaningful. And you need to take the step to map the sounds of the language, as we talked about before, the sounds of the language to the written representations, and then connect that to meaning, because inherently, individual phonemes in our language are not meaningful. Individual letters or graphemes, call them what you will, are not meaningful. It's not until they connect sound to symbol and then start to represent words which are meaningful or subwords like morphemes. Morphemes are meaningful. Individual letters are not. Individual sounds are not. Morphemes and words are meaningful. So you got to connect the sound to the symbol and then connect that to meaning. Otherwise, there's no meaning in a written orthography that you can't translate into something meaningful, right? So that's where we would disagree. There's a step preceding
Absolutely.
the semantic connection.
I agree. That's an area that we disagree on. That this distinction, they're both language systems, and we create meaning with both of them in different ways, but there's similarity.
So my question would be, and again, not to try to convince you, but how do you make a semantic connection with a letter, even a string of letters that represent a word, if you can't say the word that those letters represent? What are you making a semantic connection to?
Therein lies the question. As I said, you're making a semantic connection the minute you pick up the text. Even if you don't know the topic of the text, you are making a semantic connection to the type of syntax within that, a semantic connection that this is a meaning making thing. And as soon as you begin to encounter words, yes, you use letter clues. Absolutely. You're using a lot of information, but you are creating then the context to create greater meaning and greater meaning. So that's where we differ. And you're a good person, Claude.
Oh, well, thank
Even
you.
though we disagree. No, that's probably the major place where we disagree.
Yeah.
It's the idea of meaning precedes decoding. And I think you think that decoding is part of meaning or part of creating meaning. Did I get you right?
It's the on-ramp to meaning.
Ah, good. Mhm.
It's the passageway. That's why it's important to distinguish between decoding and word recognition,
I agree with you there.
because word recognition involves let's do a little morphological analysis. You recognize, mean again,
Recognate.
cognize, think, mental stuff going on, right? You can't recognize a word unless you know it's a word ahead of time and that you can recognize it. And I think the evidence supports the idea that decoding it is the best first step to word recognition, because that's the most reliable predictor of what the word is going to be. Far better predictor than context, pictures, syntax, anything. Those kick in after you use the first best clues.
I would disagree with the evidence. I don't know where the evidence
Well,
exists.
let's
I
look
want to
at
get
the
a book
area.
that says the evidence. But
Yes,
no,
let's look at
there's
the article
the
that you threw
evidence
out.
to show that readers are creating meaning, deep structure, and they're getting surface structure incorrect. Stephen Cousser's research showing that, students who read for deep meaning actually comprehended greater than students who read for surface level accuracy.
Once they could read. Once
Yes,
they could read. But that's what we're
yeah,
talking about. How do you get kids to be able to read? I have no disagreement with what you said, but it's once they can read, once their word recognition skills were adequate, which meant their decoding skills were adequate to then kick in context and meaning. Once they can read, what you said is no disagreement. The issue
if
is,
we
how do you get them to that point?
if we as young students were to encounter single words floating in space, I would agree with you. But words are found in some context. Yes, systematic instruction in phonics is necessary, as well as explicit phonics instruction is necessary, but far from sufficient. And it should be done with activities to develop all three cueing systems. That means kindergarten students can read from day one. They can create meaning with text. They can engage in repeated reading and choral reading. Are they decoding? No, but they're creating meaning. And therein, here's the difference. There's a difference between decoding, recognizing words, and identifying words. People get those three confused. And I think that therein lies a lot of the confusion.
Okay. So let's talk about that article that the one that you thought I was referring to about by Linnea
Yes.
Airy.
Yeah.
And that's the one with the emergent bilingual kids
Yep.
who are having difficulty getting traction, right? So
Struggling readers. They're called struggling readers.
struggling readers, right? Struggling readers. So, you know, any thoughts on that? Anything that resonated, that you didn't agree with, that you thought is problematic?
I thought I thought it was 9 pages of mush.
Mm.
What they had is one group who had individual tutors who were trained to work with individual students, and they could make changes and make changes in instruction based on what they see and student performance. They're comparing that group to uncomparable groups. A small group remediation program that the readers had no intervention instruction, and then whole class writer's workshop and reader's workshop. You're comparing things that aren't comparable. And the whole purpose of this was to obtain evidence. It said in the second paragraph, the purpose of this study was to obtain evidence to support this RES individual tutoring program. So I could have individual tutoring where I simply had students read books and write books. And if I compared that to small group bad instruction, I'm sure I would see the same differences.
Well, why don't you do that study?
Yes, now that I'm retired, I would
Yeah,
love to.
you got lots of time. No,
I
I mean
do.
I think what you say is a perfectly plausible proposition. It just lacks data.
Well, I'm not the one who put out the proposition. I'm examining the study
No,
and the
understood,
home center
understood.
study. And this study was done to discredit, I'm gonna infer here, but reading recovery. Reading recovery is mentioned twice in the literature review, and it's mentioned at the last second to the last sentence, saying this shows that reading rescue is more cost effective than reading recovery. So they went through this whole complicated study then to make this comparative analysis this kind of throwaway at the end. That I found a little bit disingenuous. They
Disingenuous.
started with the answer RES intervention is effective. Okay, let's obtain evidence. And they sure did. So now people will pull bits and pieces out of this and say, oh, that's evidence based. That's evidence based. One of her conclusions was, and there's so many things wrong with this study. I asked myself, what is more disturbing? That they thought this was a good study or that they knew it was a bad study and they did it anyway? Those are equally disturbing propositions. One of her conclusions was related. They had the tutor groups and they compared students who read text at the independent level and at the instructional level. Do you remember that?
I do.
And they said, whoa, students who read at the independent level, they were positively correlated with results, and the others were negative with reading achievement. And her conclusion was, since word reading accuracy was defined as independent reading, word reading accuracy is what led to that improvement. And my conclusion is reading material at your independent level enables you to create meaning and led to the improvement of vocabulary and other sorts of things. So it's the same data, to your point, but it's a different perspective and different interpretation of that data. She had three groups. She had the intervention, and she had the small group remediation, 3 to 6 students, and then she had the no intervention group, which were first graders and whole language. But her first question is, she said, well, let's get rid of that. Let's compare RES schools to non-RES schools, because I think there's a contamination effect that just simply by having RES interventions in your school, you're going to create this reverse kryptonite where students would suddenly get better at reading. And I think, I can only infer, but I think she was fishing for evidence. I think she had evidence, and then she rearranged that question. Why else would you do that? Contamination, that is such a kooky concept. Why would you include that in a study? And then her last thing at the note saying that this was sponsored by the literacy not-for-profit organization or some such thing. You know, they weren't involved. Here's how the game works, Claude, and you know how that works. If they didn't come up with the results that they came up with in this study, the chances that they would get further grants and further funding diminishes. And the possibilities that they would get paid consulting gigs diminish if they don't come up with results that demonstrate that something measurable, publishable, and profitable leads to better reading scores. I've been talking way too much. I'm sorry.
Well, that's okay. I mean, first of all, give credit where it's due. You read the article,
Yes.
and not to cast aspersions on other people, but I've tried to get a lot of people to read this article because it's important. And let's just say I have mixed success in engaging people with this article. So the fact that you read it and took it seriously, again, hats off to you.
I like
Um,
reading research articles like this. I think it's
well,
important.
well, that's great. I think that's why we get along.
Yes. And I think we both share it's important that the public
Yeah,
begins to understand how to analyze critically research.
yeah, yeah. No, no, absolutely, absolutely. And you obviously did more than read the abstract, which is sometimes the most I can get. Anyway, enough of that. So, um, yeah, no, those are all very interesting points. And I'm trying to decide whether it's because, there's sort of a trade-off between getting detailed, getting weedy, and losing your audience
Yep.
because most people haven't read it. And so it'd bore the heck out of them to sort of go down methodologically point by point. So let me just say a couple of things. The first one is, I mean, this is not a leading question. Regardless of what you think about it, do you think this is a study that's worth reading and considering? I mean, you devoted a considerable amount of attention to. Do you think it's because there's some studies that are done, and I say I don't think we really learn anything from this. Would you put that in that category that there's nothing really meaningful learned here?
Um, Let me answer it. I read this as well because I think it may be part of the book I'm writing because it so exemplifies buzzwords to nothingness.
Mm-hmm.
No, I do not. You can generalize to struggling first grade language minority readers.
Mm-hmm.
All right. That's it. I don't think you can generalize to any populations outside of that. You can't take this and say, let's use it with fourth graders. Yeah,
No,
that's what the general public often does.
yeah,
And this is
agreed.
called evidence. No, I don't think this is worthy of the paper it's written on. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, don't. Hey, that's why we're having this conversation. Um, in contrast, I think this is one of the most important studies done. This one and one by Sharon Vaughn on exactly the population you identified. I mean, I would not for a second say, therefore, we should apply this to all kids or fourth graders. I mean, I personally do think it has a lot of general application, but that's my inference, my
Sure.
generalization. But one of the rules, as you know, of research is you generalize to the population that you appropriately drew from, that you appropriately sampled from. But for the population of English learners or emergent, but these actually technically, I don't know if you caught this, but technically these kids were not English learners. They were not designated English learners, but they were emergent bilinguals, which is why I think that label, even though the two are not identical, it's useful because it's a broader category. These were kids who, for whatever reason, didn't qualify as English learners. Now, states have different criteria, so it's very
They
hard
call
to.
them language minority learners,
Language minority is kind of out of date.
but that's
English
the term
learners,
used.
that's right. No, no, you're exactly right. English learner, it used to be limited English proficient
Mm-hmm.
students
Yep.
that was in the legislation and the
Yep.
canonical
Deficit
laws.
based. Yep.
Now it's English learners. Here in California, the preference is for multilingual learners or emergent bilinguals. So the terminology can get confusing. But these kids were clearly emergent bilinguals, right? They came from Spanish speaking homes. They spoke some English. They were not non-English speakers, but they were learning English as they were learning to read and write. So
But we
that's a
don't know the
significant
level. I don't know much about bilingual education, but I know enough to know that all multilingual learners are not the same. It's not a homogeneous group.
Absolutely. Completely right. But these kids were in the category of English learners slash emergent bilingual, whose first language is Spanish. That's what they speak at home. They were learning some English and they were having trouble getting traction. They were, struggling. They were called struggling language minority students who were struggling to read in first grade. Whatever the nomenclature, these were kids who in kindergarten and first grade were having trouble getting traction in learning to read in English, right? That's the sample of kids, the population they drew from.
But we
And
don't
any
know
inference,
that.
yes,
All
we
we
do.
know is these are students who scored poorly on these tests.
Yeah.
It's McGinnity and parts of the GMRT4.
Yeah.
They scored poorly on it. That's all we know.
And that does not, oh, okay. So you're saying that because they scored poorly on this standardized test, that doesn't mean they were struggling readers.
That's all I'm saying. That's all we know.
Right.
It's a
But
very one-dimensional view.
I know, but I'm making the inference
Okay.
that struggling readers was operationalized at scoring below a certain level on the Gates McGinnity, the standardized reading test. And you don't accept that operationalization.
No, I don't. I don't accept that as being predictive of later achievement. But again, these are first grade students.
Yeah,
There's a lot of environmental factors that impact first grade. That's why so
clearly,
many studies are done with first grade students. It's
clearly.
easier to make a change. But all we know is that snapshot in time. And we know as well that the pre-test was different than the post-test. They pulled different parts of the test. They're not the same. And I'm wondering, why did you do that?
Okay, well, because skills change, skills evolve. When you get a ceiling effect early on, you need something that takes off the ceiling. But again, I mean, these are all reasonable methodological questions. I mean, I think we disagree on whether what they're studying is what they say they're studying. I think you think there's a total disconnect that we don't know really what they were studying and what they were doing.
I'm saying, no, we don't know. We can't define struggling readers. All we know is this population.
Okay.
They were called language minority. We don't know what that is.
Well, we
And
do
they
because she
scored
describes
poorly.
them. But Andy, unless you disbelieve her, unless you think they're lying, she describes what this population of students was. You know, they came from Spanish predominant homes. They were learning English as they were learning to read. They were having trouble. I realize you problematize the struggling because you don't accept that if you score below a certain level on a standardized test, that qualifies you for being struggling, right? But given that, she described what population of kids these kids this sample was drawn from. I think that's
Absolutely.
pretty clear.
Well, it's clear that she described the sample size. My statement is you this is not a homogeneous group. There's different levels of
Of course there
language
is.
knowledge, as oral language knowledge.
You
And
have two kids, and they're not homogeneous. I mean, there's individual differences. That's a given. That's why you do these studies with a number of kids so you can make inferences about groups of kids rather than individuals. I mean, I did case studies. I believe in case studies. I'm a big fan of case studies. I did it for my dissertation. But one of the problems with case studies, it's very difficult to generalize from a single case. So she had a group of kids who are going to be diverse within any category you choose, low income, high income, whatever, there's going to be heterogeneity. That's just a given.
yeah,
So the fact that they're different, I don't see how that invalidates the study. You have a group and you treat one group one way, you treat another group a different way. And as you say, there are three groups, a third group you kind of leave alone. I mean, that's the standard. Now, maybe the whole experimental design thing offends you. Maybe that's what you don't
that's
like,
not
if
it
it's an
at all.
experiment.
I love a good experimental design,
Uh-huh.
emphasis on good, but you have to have comparative things. And I don't know if the groups were randomly selected.
They
You know,
they were.
if there were differences, all all language minority students are not the same,
We know that, but
different
there were
levels.
pretests. But there were pretests to establish the groups were equivalent. But you don't believe in pretests. You don't believe in
Oh, I
pretests or
just
post-tests. So you're not willing to accept anything here because you
you're
don't
putting
believe in.
words in my mouth. I'm saying this idea of they were struggling readers based on a snapshot, that tells us these students
Yes,
had trouble with this test. Okay, they scored low on the test.
right.
That's where I'm going. And
Okay,
this group had varying levels. They were minority language learners, minority language students. That's what they're identified with. Okay.
correct. Correct.
So, given that, my problem is the groups were not equivalent in the treatment. That is
Right.
the biggest problem with this.
They had different treatments. That's how you do an experiment. You treat
No,
them
no,
differently
they stacked the deck to favor one treatment over another.
because
How
one
can
group
you
used
say an
tutoring.
individual tutor is the same as a small group
You
program
don't. You
where you
don't.
have to read the
No, you
script.
don't. You say that the tutoring got this effect and a small group got that effect. I mean, that's what you're exactly right. You wouldn't call them. So you're saying there's a confound here, right? That one
Well,
group
there's
got a
more than
small
one
group.
compound.
Well, okay, but let's just talk. I can only talk
Okay.
about one at a time.
Yes, you do.
I try to be holistic, but you got to sometimes parse it. So you're saying that there's a serious confound between how the groups are treated aside from the particular instructional model that was used,
That's
correct?
the biggest one. If it
Okay,
was a comparison between tutoring and small groups where you run a scripted program and we don't know about the training and level of teachers, if it was comparative teachers, comparative instruction, yes. But individual tutored students versus small group remedial packages, how do you make that comparison? The individually tutored student is going to score better. If my
okay,
job is to tutor one kid, okay. So
okay.
are schools going to have the money to hire individual tutors?
I mean, Andy, that's a reasonable question. I mean, and I would just throw back that schools, a lot of schools have, and I don't want to get into dissing reading recovery or anything like that, but I think that was the point that you considered sort of a throwaway. Schools spend a ton of money on reading recovery. And, it's problematic. It's very controversial now, whether reading recovery, I think there's some strengths in reading recovery and there's some problematic aspects to reading recovery. So they're just saying that tutoring is not that far-fetched. So if you're spending money on reading recovery, you need to think about how effectively that money is being spent if you compare it to a program that is much more explicitly based on foundational literacy skills, supplemented, augmented by English language development. That was the whole point here. Now, so
Well, for
that was the
that to
point
be
of
an apt comparison, they should compare the two
that's
groups.
right. But
So
they didn't because this study just did what it did.
then they
Now,
should have left reading recovery out of the conversation.
well, okay. So let me ask you this. Do you know, and this is a real question, do you know of any experimental study using a more like the holistic method that you prefer? And I'm not going to characterize it other than that, holistic. Any experimental study that tests whether, and I'm not saying what they find, that tests whether a tutoring program with a holistic approach that you support, how that does in terms of helping kids that you would define however you want as struggling or having difficulty, not getting traction, not getting the idea. Do you know any experimental evidence that would support that a holistic tutoring model compared to alternatives, such as in this study, tests
What do you
out whether
define as
kids,
a holistic tutoring model? I guess I'm a
well,
little confused.
whatever you want. I mean, there's an instructional model here. Let's just talk about the instructional model for a moment.
Okay, because I don't know what a holistic tutoring model is.
Well, you just got through saying a little while ago that you have a more holistic perspective. I don't want to
Yes.
put words in your mouth because,
Nope, that's different from a holistic tutoring model. But yeah, I
yeah,
have a holistic perspective
okay.
on human
And
brain and learning.
okay. And how would you define a holistic tutoring model? How would you define that?
That's a good question. Part of the things they included in the RES intervention, there were some good things there. There weren't enough of them.
Okay.
For a meaning-based approach, you can call it a model or an approach, you would have 12 interacting elements. But they had practice reading books. I didn't like that they were decodables. Nothing wrong with that if it's one part. But you'd have authentic writing, which they included there. She did some word recognition by analogy, or word identification by analogy. You would separate word identification from word recognition. You'd include vocabulary, comprehension, fluency. You'd include the big five, plus word study, plus social interaction, plus social cultural background, plus emotions, affect, motivation. That would be a holistic approach,
Okay. Okay. Fair enough.
a meaning-based
So,
approach. And the focus would be on creating meaning. And
fine.
individual skills would be taught to the greatest extent possible within that context.
Okay. Great. So take that, package that, and put it into a tutoring model. Okay?
A one-on-one tutoring model.
Yeah, I mean, just to make it comparable here. So my question is, do you know of any study that compared tutoring or small group or whatever, but what you just described as the focus of your intervention or instructional package, that put that into a like an experimental study where they compared the results of that to some alternative, either business as usual or a decoding, or do you know any study that actually put to the empirical test what you're saying is a superior approach?
Uh, of course, I cannot give you a study. I've not memorized studies, but if you want
Okay.
me to find such a study comparing something to something else, yes, I can find evidence. And
Okay.
here's the thing. You can find evidence for a variety of things. It's not, can I find one study?
Or
It's,
anything.
can you find a multiple of studies to
Sure.
support this general theory?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I can give you Sharon Vaughn's. I can give you other studies to like this one to support it. It's a little different. It's small group rather than
Yeah,
tutoring, so that'll satisfy at least one of your objections. But yeah, I mean, I would be interested to find out because I don't know of anything. See, I've been asking around to see if there are any kind of comparisons of the kind of model that you're describing to demonstrate, to at least test out the proposition that that is going to yield superior results, however you define it, however you operationalize it. I don't know of anything like that. So if you can find at least one, it would give us something to talk
I'll
about. I'm
find
not
that.
saying it wouldn't prove anything other than one study exists that has these characteristics.
I will find that. But even in the absence of that, that does not mean this bad study is acceptable.
Okay,
It does not mean comparing tutoring to a small group remedial
okay.
reading is acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what you mean by acceptable. If they accept the limitations of the study and say, look, we had tutoring versus small group, we are looking at different instructional models, but there is an important confound here, then that's being, research-wise transparent. If they
Yes,
make claims that go beyond what their study actually demonstrated, and we all know all studies have there's no perfect study. It just doesn't
absolutely.
exist. So what you pointed out here are certainly reasonable to consider and weigh with respect to how much evidence, how much weight are we going to put on this study? So can I just suggest for our next conversation, which I hope we have,
Yep,
you'll send me an article that provides some kind of contrast to this using the kind of instructional model that you think is the way to go.
I will. But you know what you did to me, Claude?
What? I didn't do anything.
You got me 2 weeks off my book because I spent 2 weeks analyzing this and writing a chapter in my book about this.
Oh,
It,
I'm sorry.
it's not,
I'm so
I'm
sorry.
saying that facetiously, but
I know.
no,
I understand. I
it
understand.
was the importance. It brought up the importance of understanding how to evaluate.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, that's exactly right. All right, I've got to hop off. As usual,
Yep,
this has been such an interesting and worthwhile conversation. I hope so for you as well.
you're the best. We'll see you in 2 or 3 weeks.
Perfect.
All right, take care.
You too.